Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of 13 Days, The Chronicle of an Escape from a German Prison, by John Caunter. Part 2, Chapter 4, My Escape from the Camp.
It may be wondered why it is that so few British officers have succeeded in escaping from prison camps in Germany. The Germans do not get very worried over the loss of a few private soldiers in that way, but they are very careful to prevent our officers from having too many chances of escape. The men are taken out to work in the fields and woods, and as the Germans have by no means too many men to spare, they cannot send a very large escort with them. Consequently, it not unfrequently happens that men are able to slip away into thick cover without the Boches seeing them or knowing of their absence until they count up their charges, maybe some hours later. The officers, on the other hand, never leave the barbed wire enclosure of the camps, unless on parole for walks, an arrangement countenanced by our War Office, so they have naturally greater difficulties to get over before commencing any dash for the frontier. Many officers have tried and have had appallingly bad luck in numerous instances. Early in the spring of 1917, the Germans warned all officers and men that they would be liable to 5 months and 3 months solitary confinement in a cell respectively if caught attempting to escape. This was as a reprisal for excessive sentences inflicted on their prisoners who attempted to escape in England under the Defense of the Realm regulations. As the solitary confinement was automatic and was given without trial, we were also warned that after undergoing it, a transgressor of this kind might be tried by court-martial for such offenses as being in possession of civilian clothes, a compass, German money, or wire cutters, etc. The charge was simple: disobedience of orders. For this, another 3 or 4 months could be imposed. I was very glad to read in the papers that all this sort of thing had been done away with by that excellent commission which went to The Hague to meet the German delegates in July 1917. There were other great things done by that same commission, and the prisoners who benefit thereby will be most grateful. Of course, it was natural that with this heavy sentence hanging over the heads of would-be escapers, some thought twice before trying, but it is worth noting that since this German order was issued, there have been more successful escapes and more attempts to escape by officers than in the whole previous period. I spoke to some of our men when out on a parole walk. They were working on a wild piece of heathland with very few Germans to guard them. I asked one whether any of them had tried to escape from there. He told me that very few had done so, as there was such a long way to go, and that when caught, the men were put in the cells and were not allowed their parcels. This meant 3/4 starvation, as the German food provided was bad and scanty. Our camp, known as Schwarmstedt, although situated 7 or 8 miles from the small town of that name, was on the Lüneburg Heide, an expanse of marshy waste ground, intersected by small streams and dotted with little woods and stunted pine trees. There were other camps on the same stretch of country. The notorious Soltau lay some miles to the north of our camp. This district is some 170 miles from the Dutch frontier as the crow flies. In preparing my escape, I had to calculate the quantity of food required to carry me through the journey. This would naturally be considerable, as I could not reckon on doing more than an average of 8 to 12 miles every 24 hours, as it was only safe to march by night, and the hours of darkness at that time of the year were only about 5.5. Although the actual distance was 145 miles, allowances to be made for detours and an indirect line, as well as for delays occasioned by such large obstacles as broad rivers and smaller but more formidable ones in the shape of German guards, would necessitate preparations for a greater distance. The food required would have to be carried, so a bag was necessary. I will not say how I got the bag or what kind it was, nor how I got my civilian clothes, for this is certain to be read by members of the thorough race whose prisoner I was, and naturally any hints I drop may be used against other prisoners. What I say outright is all known to the Germans, or obvious to the veriest fool of a prison camp commandant. My costume consisted of a long white cotton coat and a pair of white cotton pants, both dyed a dirty light gray-brown with coffee. I had a cap also, but that too must remain a mystery. As the cotton coat had no pockets and was very thin, I wore an old khaki coat underneath, which stood me in good stead when I had nearly got to the end of my journey. A pair of rubber-soled shoes, white once but made khaki color by my servant some time before, completed my kit. Although I had naturally discussed matters with others in the camp in an indefinite way, I had not arranged any collaboration in the scheme, by which I succeeded. I told only one friend 10 minutes before I took the first steps in the carrying out of the plan. When first we reached Schwarmstedt, after our journey from Krefeld, there were several weak spots in the ring of precautions against escape which surrounded it. Within 48 hours of our arrival, 3 officers got out of the camp. They had very bad luck, being caught after 11 days' travel, about 3/4 of the way to the Dutch frontier. This loophole was of course closed to further attempts by the measures now adopted by the Boers. However, 2 more got away from the camp not long afterwards and had the same atrocious luck after going about the same distance. Another individual attempt resulted in an officer getting out for some days before the same nemesis overtook him, and he too was brought back. About 10 days before my escape, yet 2 more got away and were still unaccounted for when I left the camp. They must have had the same hard fate, as I heard nothing of them in Holland or England when I arrived. After each of these attempts, the Germans discovered fresh weak spots, and the camp was rapidly becoming a stronger prison. One effect they had was to make the Germans employ more guards for the camp. Extra sentries were put on at several places, and every extra sentry means reliefs, and it takes 6 men at least to permanently provide 1 extra sentry. These men might have been helping on the farms instead, so it is some small comfort to think that even a failure to escape can do some service to our country. Of course, when I left, most of these unfortunates were back in the cells, beginning their 5-month stretch of solitary confinement. Anyone looking at the map of Germany will see immediately that from the Lüneburg Heide, north of Hanover, one has to cross the following rivers before one can reach the Dutch frontier: the Aller, Leine, Weser, Hunte, and Ems. These are all fairly large. The Aller runs along the western limits of the Lüneburg Heide, heath, and acts as a natural barrier around prison camps situated to the east of it. When we first arrived at this camp, Schwarmstedt, the commandant had practically told us in so many words that we might get away from the camp, but that we should never cross the frontier. This meant that there was something which he knew of to be passed besides the camp guards and those at the frontier. Many of us promptly understood by his remarks that he had himself made arrangements for the guarding of the bridges over the rivers. Another fact generally well known to everyone is this: all bridges over large, important rivers are guarded in Germany, and even the railway bridges over many of the smaller ones are provided with their ancient Landsturm men. On our arrival, the commandant of our camp had spoken at once to us in English, of which he knew a certain amount. We soon got to see how proud of this knowledge he was, as he would address all the English officers on some trifling subject every second day. Besides which, he would summon the senior English officer before him and all those officers who had any particular department of the camp to look after, such as kitchens, parcels, games, practically every day. The language spoken was always English. He was a fine-looking old man, covered with medals and iron crosses, a veteran of the 1866 and 1870 wars. He loved being saluted and complained that the British did not salute him enough. He was told that our officers do not salute when they are not wearing hats, and that many had got no military caps since theirs had been taken from them by the Germans at the time of their capture. He promptly ordered the canteen to get caps and sell them to us. When they arrived, they were very comic to look at, dark blue with a stiff peak. Before describing my actual exit from the camp, it is necessary that the general plan of the enclosure and its adjacent buildings be understood. The camp was oblong in shape and was surrounded on all sides by a barbed wire fence some 11 feet high. At every 50 yards there was posted a sentry, whose orders included the shooting of any hapless wretch found cutting his way through the fence or climbing over it. Opposite one of the corners of the camp, and outside of it, was situated the parcel office. Here, the prisoners' parcels were censored by the Germans in front of them. There was also a tin office here, where all tinned food not immediately required by the prisoners was kept until it was needed, when it could be taken away after being opened by a German. We often used to try and make the German soldier jump by saying Bomben or Handgranaten, just at the moment when he punctured the tin with his opener. These two offices were open until 6 o'clock in the evening, and the Germans had put up a barbed wire passage from a gate in the wire wall of the camp enclosure to the door of this office, thus enabling them to permit the prisoners free access to these two rooms until this hour. At 6 o'clock, the offices were cleared of prisoners by the numerous Germans employed there and cut off from the prisoners' part of the camp by closing the iron gate in the main wire wall of the camp. It occurred to me that if I could hide in the parcel office or tin room before 6 o'clock and be locked in when the work of the day ceased, I should naturally find myself outside the wire enclosure, which was the first and principal difficulty to be overcome by a would-be escaper. It would then remain to be seen whether it was feasible to get out of these offices by way of the skylights or other windows at a late hour. The risk was worth taking, but another difficulty presented itself. How was I to get my pack, full of food, boots, civilian clothes, etc., and all the rest of my paraphernalia, weighing fully 50 pounds, into the parcel office without making the numerous Germans I should have to pass suspicious? The solution to this question came 2 days after I was ready. At about 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday, June 19th, a tremendous wind came down on the camp, and the sandy dust rose in a huge cloud, filling everybody's eyes, noses, and mouths with fine particles. This seemed to me a good opportunity, and I quickly put my pack into a large wooden box, nailed down the lid, and carried it to the parcel office. The Germans were far too busy thinking about the dust in their eyes to wonder why a box was being carried into the parcel office, whereas boxes were always carried away from there. I passed several Germans without any trouble and got into the tin room, where I deposited the box on the floor. I now had 20 minutes in which to hide. While pretending to be extremely interested in what I was going to have for my meal that evening, I looked round and saw at once that the best hiding place without doubt was on the top of the pigeonholes in which everybody kept their tins. These pigeonholes, about 2 feet square and 2.5 feet deep, were made of wood and were ranged along each wall, tier above tier, for about 12 to 14 feet. There was a ledge at the top about 2 feet below the level of the roof. I decided to get up onto that ledge, knowing full well that nobody looks round a room at a much higher level than his own eyes, and that a hungry German gaze would never wander farther than the level of the nearest food. This was a good start, but unfortunately, there was a Boche painting numbers on the lockers within 6 feet of the spot from which I should have to climb up to my hiding place. However, he did not look intelligent, wore spectacles, and was very engrossed in his work, so I thought I could risk his not seeing me. I had rubber shoes on, my boots being in the bag, so I was not afraid on the score of noise. I was lucky in choosing the right moment and succeeded in climbing slowly and quietly up and then putting myself into a lying position along the ledge without either the Boche or 3 other English officers getting out tins nearby, being aware that anything strange had happened. I lay there hardly daring to breathe, with 4 slats of wood fixed crossways in a vertical position, so that the sharp edges were uppermost, catching me at various unprotected and tender points of my body and legs. However, it did not last forever. The officers left, and no more came in, and then the German soldier packed up his tools. He left, and very shortly afterwards in came the under-officer in charge. He looked at the windows, walked round the office, and then, quickly slipping a tin from a handy pigeonhole into his pocket, left the room, locking the door after him. I was locked in and was able to breathe again. After giving my pilfering friend another 20 minutes, in case he should have underestimated his appetite and should return for more, I got down and rubbed my cramped legs. This done, I had a meal and then settled myself down to wait till 11 o'clock, which I deemed the earliest hour for commencing operations with safety. The skylights appeared to be the best exit from the room, and under one of them there was a convenient beam. The other skylight proved to be out of reach of anything. Since the building was of wood, I had to exercise great caution in moving about, so creaky were the boards. At 11 o'clock, I climbed up to the beam and then crawled along it till I was exactly under my skylight. Then, getting my shoulders well under it, I heaved. Horror of horrors! It gave an awful crack and would not budge a hair's breadth. This was a nuisance, only I called it something stronger than that. I got down, afraid that the loud crack must have alarmed the sentries, two of whose beats joined exactly opposite this tin room. However, I was able to thank my good luck again, as they had heard nothing. I had now to find another way out. I tried unpicking the lock with a bent nail, but had no success. I then tried to take the screws out of the lock with a table knife. One came loose, but the others refused to shift at all. Foiled here, I tried the wooden partition between the tin room and the passage beyond. But again, I could make no progress, as the carpenters had done their work too well. I sat down on my box and sweated. The atmosphere of this closed room was simply appalling, and my clothes were wringing wet by reason of it. It looked now as if I should be found next morning in this office and get 5 months solitary confinement in the cells for trying to escape, and not even have a run for my money. There still remained one chance, the most dangerous, and therefore left until desperation should drive me to it. The side windows of the tin office, some 3.5 feet from the floor, opened onto the sentry's beat, exactly opposite the point where the other sentry, whose beat ran at right angles to the office, joined in. In addition, there was a large arc lamp within 30 feet of these windows. My idea now was to watch until both sentries should be walking down their beats away from me, and therefore naturally with their backs turned, and then open my window, jump out, and run for it. The windows were made in 2 halves, hinging at the sides and opening outwards. I could always get the sentry opposite the window walking in the right direction as a beginning. I had then to open the right half of the window 3 or 4 inches in order to see where the other sentry was, as he walked up and down parallel to the windows and close up against the building. Of course, I was in mortal dread each time I opened my window to find out his position, of discovering myself looking straight into his face. I never got such a bad shock as that, but neither did I ever get the 2 of them walking with their backs turned at the same time. Wednesday, 20th June. I had to shut the window every time I saw that he was approaching, as he was certain to see it when he came close if I left it open. 9 times I tried this experiment and had no luck. I then sat down to think for a bit. Fortunately, I remembered now that the sentries were changed at 2:30 a.m., so I thought that I would try to turn this fact to my advantage. Sentry changing consisted of 12 Germans in file marching round the camp, clockwise, picking up the old sentry and dropping the new one. I hoped that the noise caused by their heavy boots would drown all noise made by me, and that this crowd of men rounding the corner and marching towards my most difficult sentry would hide me from him. It happened just as I hoped. They relieved the sentry opposite my window well down his beat, and he stood still, as they always do for a minute or two after being newly posted. Then on came the 12 Landsturmmen, rounded the corner, making a fine noise and dust with their heavy boots. When the last of them was about 15 yards from my window, and all 12 were strung out between it and the difficult sentry, I pushed open both halves of the window, pitched out my heavy pack, which fell with a thud, and jumped out after it. To pick it up, jump into the ditch, run along the path, and round the corner away from the dazzling rays of the arc lamp did not take many seconds. I was out. I listened for the excitement which would tell of the discovery of my flight, but all was quiet, so I was able to steal off in a westerly direction.
This concludes today's reading of 13 Days, The Chronicle of an Escape from a German Prison, by John Caunter. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.